Jason Bordoff, the founding executive director of Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, one of the most respected energy economists alive, said this to Axios 2 weeks ago, and I need you to hear every word of it. He said there is no policy option to prevent oil prices from marching up toward $200 a barrel if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. No policy option, not a limited set of policy options. Not difficult policy options. No policy option. The man who ran energy policy on Obama's National Security Council, who advises governments around the world, who sits at the intersection of energy markets and geopolitical strategy, is telling you that if the strait stays shut, $200 oil is not a risk. It is a destination, and oil is not at $70 anymore. It is not at $82, which is where the IMF's baseline forecast assumes it will average for the year. It is above $95 right now, nearly 40% above pre-war levels, with the ceasefire having collapsed, the Islamabad peace talks having failed, Trump having declared a U.S. naval blockade of the strait, and Iran's IRGC having warned that any military vessel approaching the strait would be met with a severe response. The gap between $95 and $200 is $105. And in a market where the price rose $50 in a single week when the strait first closed, that gap can evaporate in a matter of days if Iran makes one move. One move. And there are at least 6 moves Iran could make that would send oil past $200 before most Americans wake up to what happened. And not a single one of them is theoretical. Every single one has historical precedent, operational capability, and strategic motivation. And I am going to walk through each of them right now with the specific data on what each one would mean for the price of oil, the price of gasoline, the cost of food, and the financial future of every American household. Move 1. Iran detonates the mines it already planted in the strait and makes the waterway physically unnavigable. Iran has already laid sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz. This is not speculation. The IRGC confirmed it. The U.S. Navy has begun mine clearance operations, and according to at least one report cited by multiple sources, Iran has lost track of some of the mines it planted, meaning there are explosive devices floating in one of the most heavily trafficked waterways on Earth whose exact location is unknown even to the people who put them there. If Iran detonates additional mines or deploys a second wave of mine laying in the strait, the waterway becomes physically unnavigable for commercial tankers, regardless of what any ceasefire or diplomatic agreement says. Insurance is the mechanism that matters here, not geopolitics. Kepler, the commodities intelligence firm, made a critical observation in their March analysis. They said the Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed for commercial shipping despite technically remaining open because insurance withdrawal is doing the work that a physical blockade has not. War risk insurance premiums for the strait surged from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of the ship's insurance value per transit. For very large crude carriers, that increase alone adds $250,000 per transit. And multiple insurance providers have simply canceled war risk coverage entirely for vessels transiting the strait. When a tanker cannot obtain insurance, it cannot legally carry cargo. When it cannot carry cargo, it does not transit the waterway. The insurance market, which operates on actuarial models of risk, has independently concluded that the Strait of Hormuz is too dangerous for commercial operations. A single additional mine detonation beneath a loaded tanker would confirm the insurance industry's worst-case assessment and trigger a complete withdrawal of coverage that could last months or years after the physical threat is cleared. During the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the late 1980s, Iran laid mines throughout the Persian Gulf, and the mine-clearing operations took more than 2 years to complete. The USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in April 1988 and nearly sank. 38 years later, the mines are more sophisticated, the tankers are larger, and the economic consequences of a single successful attack are exponentially greater. Bloomberg reported that more than 36 oil and gas traders, executives, brokers, shippers, and advisors said the same thing in interviews over the past weeks. The world still has not grasped the severity of the situation. Many drew parallels with the 1970s oil shock, warning that a prolonged closure of the strait would threaten an even bigger crisis than the OPEC embargo of 1973. And the mine threat is not the only mechanism by which Iran controls the strait without deploying a single warship. The Congress Research Service published a detailed analysis documenting Iran's strategic calculus. They noted that in the late 1980s, toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian forces laid mines throughout the Persian Gulf, including in the Strait of Hormuz, as part of the so-called quote zero. With the land conflict stalemated, Iranian and Iraqi forces each attacked the other's energy infrastructure and tankers. That tanker war lasted years. Mines that were laid in the late 1980s were still being discovered and cleared into the 1990s, and the mines Iran has now are more advanced, more difficult to detect, and designed to defeat modern minesweeping technology. The U.S. Navy has begun mine clearance operations in the Strait, but CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper noted that while at least 17 Iranian ships were destroyed as of early March, the mine clearing operation is a fundamentally different and much longer undertaking. You can destroy a ship in minutes. Clearing a minefield in a 21-mile-wide strait with strong currents, irregular depths, and an adversary who may still be actively deploying new mines takes months. And during every day of that mine clearance, the insurance markets remain closed to commercial tankers. The oil remains trapped, and the price continues to rise. Move 2. Iran destroys Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura terminal and removes 6 million barrels per day from the market in one strike. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura oil terminal is the largest crude oil loading facility in the world. It handles approximately 6 to 7 million barrels per day of export capacity. In September 2019, the Houthis demonstrated that Saudi oil infrastructure is vulnerable when drone and missile attacks hit the Abqaiq processing facility and the Kuris oil field, temporarily knocking out 5.7 million barrels per day of Saudi production, roughly half of Saudi output. That single attack briefly spiked oil prices by 15% in a single trading session. The attack was repaired within weeks because the physical damage was limited and the infrastructure was not targeted for permanent destruction. Iran has far greater strike capability than the Houthis. The IRGC has already demonstrated the willingness and ability to strike Saudi facilities during the current conflict. Saudi Arabia's largest refinery has been targeted by drone attacks. Qatar's LNG export facilities have been hit. And Qatar Energy warned that damage to parts of the world's biggest LNG plant will take up to 5 years to repair. 5 years, not 5 weeks. If Iran directed a sustained strike package at Ras Tanura, Dar and Abqaiq and the east-west pipeline infrastructure simultaneously, the result would be the instantaneous removal of 6 to 10 million barrels per day of Saudi export capacity from the global market on top of the 10 million barrels already trapped by the Hormuz closure. The combined loss would approach 20 million barrels per day, approximately 20% of global consumption, from a market that has no spare capacity capable of replacing it on any timeline shorter than years. OPEC Plus retains approximately 3.5 million barrels per day of theoretical spare capacity, concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But as Kapler documented, a significant portion of that spare capacity cannot reach global markets if the strait is inaccessible. And if the production infrastructure itself is destroyed, spare capacity is meaningless because there is no functioning facility to produce the oil, even if a route to market existed. The Atlas Institute for International Affairs published an analysis documenting that combined bypass pipeline capacity around the strait covers only approximately 2.6 million barrels per day, a fraction of the 20 million that normally transits Hormuz. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar have no comparable pipeline alternatives. Even in the most optimistic scenario, 2/3 of current Gulf crude exports remain physically dependent on the strait. If Iran destroys Saudi surface infrastructure while maintaining the Hormuz closure, the global oil market loses access to approximately 70% of Gulf production capacity simultaneously. At that level of disruption, $200 per barrel is not the ceiling, it is the floor. Move 3. Iran attacks tankers outside the strait and makes the entire Arabian Sea a war zone. Iran has already launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships in and around the Strait of Hormuz since the war began. At least 3 tankers have been struck near the strait, including one off Oman that was set ablaze. And the IRGC has targeted vessels from neutral nations, including ships sailing under Thai, Japanese, and Marshall Islands flags. The Euronews analysis documented that by striking countries that have not attacked them directly, Tehran is signaling that no maritime trade is safe as long as the strikes on its soil continue. If Iran extends its attacks beyond the Strait of Hormuz into the broader Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, or the approaches to the Red Sea, the insurance exclusion zone would expand dramatically. Currently, insurance exclusions apply to the Strait and the Persian Gulf. An attack on a tanker in the Arabian Sea, 500 miles from the Strait, would force insurers to recalculate the risk for the entire Indian Ocean trade route. Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd have already suspended transits through the Strait. Houthi-controlled Yemen announced on February 28 that it would resume attacks on Israel and commercial ships in the Red Sea, forcing Suez Canal traffic to be rerouted around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. That rerouting adds 2 to 3 weeks to transit times and dramatically increases shipping costs. If the Arabian Sea becomes a second exclusion zone, the entire maritime trade architecture connecting Asia to Europe and Africa collapses into a single viable route around the Cape of Good Hope, which is already congested from the Suez rerouting. Every barrel of oil, every container of goods, every LNG tanker that would normally transit the Indian Ocean through the Strait would be forced onto a 12,000-mile detour that doubles transit time and triples shipping costs. The impact on oil prices would not be the direct loss of production, but the logistics premium. Oil that exists but cannot be economically delivered to the refineries that need it is functionally the same as oil that does not exist. And the logistics premium in a scenario where the entire western Indian Ocean becomes a war zone would push the delivered cost of crude into territory that has no historical precedent. And this scenario is not hypothetical. It is already partially in effect. The Houthi announcement on February 28 that they would resume attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea has already forced Suez traffic to reroute around Africa. That reroute was already in partial effect since late 2023, and the Iran war has intensified it dramatically. The combination of the Hormuz closure, the Houthi Red Sea threat, and the potential for Iranian attacks in the Arabian Sea creates a three-zone maritime exclusion area covering the entire energy trade corridor from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. No historical conflict has ever simultaneously threatened all three waterways. The 1973 OPEC embargo was political. The infrastructure was intact. The shipping lanes were open. The 2026 crisis is fundamentally different because the infrastructure is damaged, the shipping lanes are mined and contested, and the diplomatic solution has already failed. The Islamabad talks collapsed. The ceasefire collapsed, and the U.S. naval blockade is itself a new escalation vector that could trigger the very Iranian response that sends oil to $200. Mike Summers, CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, told Bloomberg that the playbook is pretty bare at this point. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve has already been tapped. The IEA has already executed the largest coordinated release in history. If Iran expands the geographic scope of its attacks, there is no additional policy lever available that would prevent prices from accelerating toward $200 and potentially beyond. Move 4. Iran institutionalizes the toll system and makes the Strait a permanent revenue weapon. Iran has begun charging tolls of over $1 million per ship for passage through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a wartime measure. It is the beginning of a permanent revenue infrastructure that Iran is building in real time under the cover of the conflict. CNBC reported that Iran is finalizing a joint maritime protocol with Oman to institutionalize coordinated management of tanker traffic through the Strait, which could embed Iranian authority over the crucial energy artery into a standing bilateral agreement. If Iran successfully establishes a toll regime that survives the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a permanent choke point tax on 20% of the world's oil. At $1 million per transit for a very large crude carrier that loads approximately 2 million barrels, the toll adds 50 cents per barrel before the oil has even reached open water. That cost is passed directly to refineries, then to consumers, and the toll would give Iran a structural incentive to restrict traffic because scarcity increases the value of each transit permission. A controlled access strait with Iranian toll authority would function like a permanent tariff on global energy imposed by a single nation, collected at a geographic choke point and unregulated by any international body. The implications for oil pricing are not limited to the cost of the toll itself. The existence of a toll regime creates permanent uncertainty about access. Any tanker operator, any refinery, any commodity trader who depends on Hormuz transited oil must now price in the risk that Iran could increase the toll, restrict access, or close the strait entirely at any future date for any future political reason. That risk premium becomes embedded in every futures contract, every insurance policy, and every long-term supply agreement that involves Gulf oil. And embedded risk premiums do not disappear when the immediate crisis ends. They persist for years or decades because the structural vulnerability has been demonstrated and the incentive to exploit it has been proven. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies estimated that a one-year closure of the strait would result in a 15% decline in global LNG supply relative to 2024 levels, a shortfall that no amount of demand-side adjustment could fully absorb in the short term. If Iran captures permanent control of the strait through a toll and access regime, every forecast about future energy costs must be revised upward permanently, and the geopolitical implications extend far beyond energy pricing. If Iran successfully institutionalizes toll authority over a waterway through which 20% of global oil transits, it establishes a precedent that any nation controlling a maritime choke point can monetize that control permanently. China has been watching the Hormuz situation with intense strategic interest because China controls or has significant influence over multiple maritime choke points in the South China Sea. If Iran's toll model succeeds and is normalized by the international community through tacit acceptance, the strategic calculus for every choke point controlling nation on Earth changes overnight. The implications for global trade, for shipping costs, for insurance markets, and for the price of every commodity that crosses an ocean would be transformative. And those implications would be permanent because once the precedent is established, it cannot be unestablished by diplomacy or treaty. The genie does not go back in the bottle. And every commodity trader, every shipping company, and every refinery operator on Earth understands this, which is why the toll system that Iran is building right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy story. It is a story about the future structure of global commerce, and that structure, if it shifts, shifts permanently. Move 5. Iran triggers a cascading LNG crisis that destroys the fertilizer supply chain and creates a global food emergency. The Strait of Hormuz does not only carry oil, it carries approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, primarily from Qatar's massive North Field complex. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG export contracts when the strait closed. Internal sources told Reuters that Qatar Energy would soon begin shutting down gas liquefaction plants because LNG tankers could not leave the Gulf and that restarting those plants would take weeks. Parts of the world's biggest LNG plant have already sustained missile damage that Qatar Energy warned will take up to 5 years to repair. 5 years. And the LNG disruption is not just an energy problem, it is a food problem. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for the production of nitrogen fertilizer, which is the most widely used fertilizer in global agriculture. Ammonia, urea, and ammonium nitrate are all synthesized from natural gas. When LNG supply from Qatar is cut off, the downstream impact hits fertilizer production within weeks, and the timing of the Hormuz closure could not have been worse for global food security. The strait was blocked at the end of February, directly before the Northern Hemisphere spring planting season. The Wikipedia entry on the economic impact of the war documented that the LNG disruption during the spring planting season could reduce the planting and yields of corn in the United States, the main feedstock for U.S. beef, poultry, and dairy, and potentially increase global food prices into 2027. Global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher during the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues. And unlike oil, the fertilizer sector does not have internationally coordinated strategic reserves. There is no strategic fertilizer reserve equivalent to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. When fertilizer supply is disrupted, there is no emergency stockpile to release. The supply gap translates directly into reduced planting, reduced yields, and higher food prices with a lag of approximately 6 to 12 months from the supply disruption to the grocery store shelf. Which means the fertilizer impact of the Hormuz closure that began in February will show up in American food prices in the fall and winter of 2026 and into 2027. Long after the headlines about the war have faded from the news cycle. If Iran escalates the LNG disruption by specifically targeting Qatar's remaining export infrastructure or by maintaining the strait closure through the summer growing season, the fertilizer cascade becomes a food crisis. And a food crisis on top of an energy crisis on top of an affordability crisis that was already the worst. In a generation creates conditions that no modern American government has ever had to manage. Move 6. Iran does nothing and the market still goes to $200 because the buffers are already exhausted. Here is the scenario that almost nobody is discussing. Iran does not need to make another move. The current situation, maintained unchanged for another 60 to 90 days, is sufficient by itself to send oil past $200. The buffers that have kept oil below $100 since the ceasefire are temporary and finite. The IEA's record 400 million barrel strategic reserve release is being consumed. The ships that escaped the strait before the closure and were already in transit have reached their destinations. The oil that was already in floating storage has been delivered. Each of those buffers was a one-time release. Once the oil in transit is consumed, once the strategic reserves are drawn down, once the floating storage is emptied, the market confronts the raw reality of a sustained 10-plus million barrel per day supply deficit with no replacement. Jason Bordoff told Axios that in the next several weeks you are going to see the physical reality of oil shortfalls catching up to market trading activity, and that is going to cause oil prices to have to rise fast enough to make people use less oil. Read that last phrase again. Rise fast enough to make people use less oil. That is the mechanism by which oil reaches $200. Not through a single dramatic event, but through the slow exhaustion of every buffer, every alternative, every workaround, until the only remaining mechanism to balance supply and demand is the price itself rising high enough to destroy demand. Demand destruction means people and businesses stop using oil because they literally cannot afford it. Airlines cancel routes, trucking companies park rigs, factories reduce shifts, consumers stop driving, farmers reduce tractor hours. That is what $200 oil does. It does not just make energy expensive, it makes economic activity expensive, and when economic activity becomes expensive enough, it stops. Rystad Energy's Jorge Leon estimated that even after the conflict comes to an end, it could take 6 months or more for markets to return to normal. ING analysts noted that even if the strait reopens, clearing the vessel backlog would take time, with production, exports, and LNG flows normalizing only gradually. The De Beer Group's CEO warned that households should prepare for the possibility that energy costs will not return to pre-crisis levels. Fitch projects that a 3-month closure would result in Brent averaging $100 for the full year. As of mid-April, the closure is approaching its second month with no resolution in sight. And Macquarie, a financial services company, assigned a 40% probability to oil reaching $200 if the war drags into June. June is 7 weeks away. OPEC has already cut its Q2 oil demand forecast by 500,000 barrels, citing the impact of the war. OPEC's own output fell by 7.7 million barrels per day in March alone. And the IEA warned that the disruption in April may transpire to have been worse than in March, adding that nothing is being loaded right now. Nothing. Not some, not a reduced volume, nothing. The strait is shut, the buffers are draining, the alternatives are exhausted, and the only variable remaining is time. The longer the closure persists, the closer $200 becomes. And Iran does not have to do anything new to make it happen. Iran just has to wait. And here's the dimension that makes the waiting strategy so devastating for the global economy. Every week that the strait remains closed, the countries that depend on Middle Eastern oil are being forced to compete for the same limited pool of non-Gulf supply. Bloomberg reported that U.S. oil exports to Asia are poised to surge in April as refineries hunt for alternative suppliers to replace Middle East barrels. A senior oil trader in Latin America described receiving calls from buyers they had been unsuccessfully courting for years, who are now desperate to purchase and willing to seal deals with little or no negotiation. That desperation bidding is the mechanism that drives prices above the level justified by the actual physical shortage. When multiple buyers compete for the same limited barrel, the price is set not by the cost of production, but by the desperation of the buyer. And the most desperate buyers will pay whatever it takes to keep their refineries running, their economies functioning, and their populations from rioting. Countries in Asia are already hoarding and rationing fuel, according to Bloomberg. Pakistan told cricket fans to watch games from home to preserve fuel. Dozens of countries, many of them lower income, are taking emergency measures, including closing schools and mandating remote work, according to the IEA. The United Kingdom is facing jet fuel shortages, and the desperation bidding is just beginning. The ships that escaped the strait before the closure are being consumed. The strategic reserves are being drawn down. The alternative suppliers are reaching capacity limits. Each week that passes narrows the remaining options and widens the gap between supply and demand, and the price fills that gap because the price is the only mechanism left. Jason Bordoff said it clearly. Oil prices will have to rise fast enough to make people use less oil. That is the definition of demand destruction, and demand destruction at a global scale means recession at a global scale. The IMF has already warned of it. The ECB has already modeled it. The Conference Board has already projected it. And every day the strait remains closed brings the world one day closer to the moment when the buffers are exhausted and the price does the work that diplomacy, military action, and strategic reserves have all failed to do. What $200 oil means for the American household in specific dollars. At $200 per barrel, the national average gasoline price would reach approximately $7 to $8 per gallon based on the historical relationship between crude prices and pump prices. At $8 per gallon, filling a 15-gallon tank costs $120. For a household with 2 cars that fill up weekly, monthly fuel costs reach approximately $960 per month. That is more than many Americans' mortgage payments. Diesel at $200 crude would reach approximately $9 to $10 per gallon. Every product that is transported by truck, which is virtually every product in America, would see its transportation cost component increase by 100 to 150%. Grocery prices, which have already risen 36% since 2014, would surge an additional 15 to 25% within 90 days of the oil shock as the diesel cost cascades through the food supply chain. A family of 4 spending $1,100 per month on groceries would see that cost rise to $1,350 to $1,400. Electricity prices, already rising faster than wages, would spike further as natural gas prices track the oil increase. Home heating oil, which 5 million American households depend on, would more than triple from pre-war levels. Airline ticket prices would increase 40 to 60% as jet fuel costs, which have already exceeded $200 per metric ton in some Asian markets, cascade into ticket pricing globally, and the secondary effects would be even more destructive than the direct price increases. Businesses that cannot absorb the energy cost increase would cut staff, reduce hours, or close entirely. Small businesses with thin margins, restaurants, independent retailers, local service providers would be the first casualties. The unemployment rate, which has been held artificially low by the low-hire-low-fire equilibrium that Stanford documented, would break out of that equilibrium into active layoffs as the energy shock forces businesses to reduce their cost base by the only large variable they control: labor. The combination of surging prices and rising unemployment is the classical definition of stagflation, which is the economic condition that America has not experienced since the early 1980s when Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20% to break the cycle. Nobody in Washington is prepared for $200 oil. There is no contingency plan. There is no policy response designed for this scenario. The last time America experienced an oil shock of comparable magnitude was 1979, when the Iranian Revolution disrupted 4 million barrels per day and gasoline lines stretched for miles across the country. The 2026 scenario is 4 to 5 times larger in terms of supply disruption. The 1979 crisis disrupted 4 million barrels per day. The current crisis has disrupted 10 million or more. And the American economy in 1979 was far less dependent on just-in-time supply chains, global shipping, and diesel-powered logistics than it is today. In 1979, the food supply chain was more localized, more domestically sourced, and less dependent on continuous diesel-powered refrigerated transport. In 2026, every apple, every gallon of milk, every package of chicken in every grocery store in America arrived on a diesel truck that drove an average of 1,500 miles from the point of production. The food system has been optimized for efficiency, which means it has been optimized for fragility. And a $200 oil shock would expose that fragility in every grocery store in the country within 30 to 60 days. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is already at its lowest level since 1984 and being drawn down further. The IEA has already executed the largest coordinated release in history. The Federal Reserve cannot cut rates because inflation is already at 3.3% and accelerating. The American Petroleum Institute's CEO said the playbook is pretty bare at this point. Iraq's deputy prime minister raised the prospect of $200 to $300 per barrel in an extreme scenario. Daniel Yergin, the dean of global energy analysis, was asked at the premier energy conference in Houston whether $200 was possible. He declined to give a specific forecast, but noted that you do hear $200. Eurasia Group puts 55% odds on the war lasting through May. Macquarie assigns 40% probability to $200 if the war drags into June. And Jason Bordoff, the Columbia professor who has no political motive and no financial position to protect, said the words that every American needs to hear and internalize. There is no policy option to prevent it. There is no policy option. The only question is whether the strait stays closed long enough for the buffers to run out and the price to do the work that policy cannot. And every day that passes without a resolution brings that moment closer. Share this video with every American you know who drives a car, heats a home, buys groceries, or has a job that depends on any of those things being affordable. Because the price at the pump today, the $4.15 that feels painful right now, may be the last affordable gasoline most Americans see for a very long time.